Hello, ACLAR folks. Hello to beautiful Perth. Hello to you wherever you are in the world. My name is Alex. I'm from the University of Canberra, and today we're going to be talking about some non-binary books. Narratologist Susan S. Lancer argues that questions of representation, and especially of queer representation, are as much questions of form as they are of content. When exploring current and potential advances in queer fiction, how these stories are told is just as important to consider as the events and characters they depict. Today, I'll be drawing on a chapter in my soon-to-be-submitted doctoral thesis, and will specifically explore this idea through a study of narrative voice, arguing that perspective and point of view hold great potential power in the growing field of queer YA, in particular YA that represents non-binary characters. I will cover three styles today: the YA staple of first-person perspective and how this overlaps with Talia Betcher's concept of first-person authority, the less common but still useful close third-person narration and what visible pronouns and names might offer to a narrative of gender affirmation, and finally the underexplored realm of omniscient third-person narration that may affirm queer gender as possible using the voice of God. Today I'm going to weigh and explore the kind of benefits and risks of each style, and to discuss why I've ultimately chosen to write my own manuscript in omniscient third person. So, as a project about non-binary representation, it seems logical to start with a nice definition of what exactly that is. So what does it mean to be non-binary? That is a fascinating question with a variety of answers that I don't necessarily have time to get into today if I want ample time for my analysis. But for our purposes, the short version is non-binary is an umbrella term that covers gender identities outside, beyond, or in between the categories of male and female, man and woman. There are many more specific or micro-identities under the umbrella that members of the community might use to convey their gender configuration, and there are also other encompassing terms such as genderqueer, which is a slightly older phrase coined by trans activist Ricky Wilchins in the 1990s, that people may prefer to use instead. This project primarily uses non-binary as its umbrella terminology, though I also use genderqueer where Wilchins' phrasing is relevant, or the even more encompassing language of queer gender, which is a notion I hope will convey the idea of gender across the bounds of non-binary, trans, binary, trans, gender non-conforming, and otherwise non-cisgender experiences and expressions of gender. And if you want more information about the many ins and outs of non-binary gender, its evolving linguistics, and the theory and history surrounding it, I can recommend these essay questions and resource books on the screen. But let's dive into non-binary fiction. So non-binary representation in YA has been increasing, I want to say, exponentially over the past few years. But how are these stories told, and how are authors using narrative voice in these novels with non-binary protagonists? As it's somewhat of a staple of YA, let's begin with first person. So simply put, it is, quote, a voice in which a character uses his own voice to tell about his experiences and thoughts. Essentially, we are inside the main character's head, privy to their thoughts, and they narrate their story as I did, I said, I felt, so on and so forth. There are many reasons suggested as to why this is the most popular and preferred style for most YA. Gwenda Bond suggests that it characteristically, quote, offers great immediacy and has a low amount of psychic distance between the protagonist and the reader, which is ideal for fostering connection and empathy, and the feeling that the book is a conversation or a confessional between narrator and narratee. Now, I argue that first-person narration also has elements of what transgender philosopher Talia May Betcher called first-person authority. In her 2009 chapter, Betcher applies the epistemology of first-person authority to the self-articulation of gender identity. While in her own words, gender isn't necessarily as simple as because I say I am, Betcher's concept places ethical weight on the avowal of existential self-identity. The authoritative voice on any individual's gender is the individual themselves, and Betcher likens a denial of this authority as a dismissal of personal agency akin to violence. And this is neat because it crucially shifts the narrative of gender identity to, as Yinda Jas writes, a result of self-evaluation rather than external classification. in medical, legal, and social contexts, gender identity and trans status, binary and non, has traditionally been associated with a gatekeeper's judgment of a set of observable criteria. So Betcher's call for the recognition of self-identification is philosophical in its context, but also highly practical, calling for a breakdown of these systems and a recognition that a person's articulation of their own gender is the most authentic and, for want of a better word, true expression of it. While Betcher initially suggested this model in a binary trans context, it does echo and have application across non-binary discourse as well, and it proves a useful framework for exploring the importance of language, euphoria, and personal affirmation emphasized in much non-binary scholarship and activism and fiction. In their book Beyond the Gender Binary, activist Alok Vaidmanon invites the reader to consider that, quote, gender is not what people look like to other people, it is what we know ourselves to be. In novels narrated in first person, the protagonist is invited to use their own voice to express and articulate their avowal of existential self-identity to the reader in an intimate conversation that the reader is invited in turn to take as truth. First-person narrators in YA may be unreliable in many ways, but by their nature their knowledge is limited. But for this analysis, let's consider that these protagonists are at least written to know themselves. So first-person narration facilitates gender identity expressed directly to the reader by the narrator, as well as facilitating the kinds of gender journeys that and arcs of self-discovery that are often present in coming-of-age stories. So most commonly, authors of these texts have their protagonists articulate their identity in their own voice, whether in dialogue or in internal narration or both. For example, Mason Deaver's I Wish You All the Best, out in 2019, is a realist coming-of-age story narrated in first person. The reader learns of the protagonist Ben's felt sense of gender and shows an identity label in Ben's own narration voice. I said those three little words, I am non-binary. Ben tells us this right there on page 14. In these scenes where Ben expresses their non-binary identity in internal narration, they come out, as it were, to the reader, and the reader comes to understand this as the internal truth of the text. Ben also gets to use first-person authority to express their identity to other characters in their spoken dialogue, but the reader gets to have that conversation with them first. This technique is repeated throughout various contemporary YA novels, including Mia Siegert's Somebody Told Me and Kacen Callender's Felix Ever After. Now, as well as its intersection with ideas of first-person authority, first-person narration is also relevant to our discussion here because of its structural qualities. As Lancer explores, first-person narration opens the possibility for narrative situations in which we have no way to know the sex, gender, and/or sexuality of the narrating voice. Because first person is less sex-specific than the third person, at least in English and other languages with neutral, non-gendered first-person pronouns, the gender of a character may be rendered totally invisible or ambiguous if they are the story's I. This opens the possibility for a narrator character whose gender remains just totally unknown to the reader, but it also opens new possibilities for narrators who do not align with binary gender, and new possibilities for the kinds of flexible and elastic explorations of gender often featured in non-binary YA. A character who changes pronouns throughout the story, whether due to gender fluidity or exploring different options, doesn't have to change the way the prose is constructed around them if they remain the story's I. This is the case in Siegert's Somebody Told Me, as well as some other novels such as Lindsay Miller's Mask of Shadows. The non-gendered I can also be used to facilitate a narrator character with no pronouns, such as in A.R. Capetta's The Heartbreak Bakery from 2021. The narrator, Sid, tentatively identifies as agender and jokes that Sid pronouns are no thanks. Sid admits to, quote, avoiding pronouns in my head for years, and this reflects in and is represented by the text itself, which does the exact same thing. Capetta capitalizes on the ambiguity afforded by the neutral first-person I to create an unambiguously non-binary narrator, rejecting the notion that the text must be stabilized by gendering Sid inside the binary and inside grammatical rules. Capetta definitely avoids the logistics of structuring a sentence in a story around a pronounless character and creates a metatextual space in which said character just isn't required to settle on a definitive set of descriptors. Thus, the gender exploration plotline enabled and enhanced by the narration style itself. So first-person narration offers many possibilities for the expression and affirmation of non-binary binary identity in YA novels. However, while first-person and its characteristic embrace of first-person authority are to be celebrated, I also invite you to consider another point of view method and what unique capabilities these might also have. So while first person is indisputably king, many novels also use close or limited third person. As Bond explains, in limited third person, the narrator focuses on a chosen character, while still having a sense of being outside that character. Maybe best conceptualized as looking over their shoulder rather than being in their head. The crucial difference for our purposes here is that, rather than being the story's I, protagonists narrated in third person have their name and pronouns visible on the page. While making those things invisible has advantages, as in the Heartbreak Bakery, third person lets authors express and affirm their characters' non-binary identity in different ways. So much of this potential here relates to the concept of narrative authority. Going back to Lancer, quote, while the autodiegetic I remains a structurally superior voice mediating the voices of other characters, it does not carry the superhuman privileges that attach to authorial voice. While there is a marked difference between close third person and omniscient third person, that I'll return to shortly, it remains true that there is an unspoken notion of authority embedded in third person. Whereas first person is recognised to be limited to what the narrator character can know and perceive, and thus unreliable or biased to a certain degree. Third-person narration is often used to infer a degree of narrative truth outside the confines of the defined protagonist experience. I argue this association between third-person voice and narrative authority can offer unique affirmative qualities to stories about non-binary characters. For example, how Shreve's Out of Salem from 2019 is narrated in close third person. Thus the protagonist's chosen name, Z, and their they-them pronouns are consistently present on the page. So as well as immediately coding Z as non-binary, the visibility of Z's neutral pronouns renders them the truth of the text and the rules the narration is following. This creates an intriguing dissonance when, having been introduced to Z as Z, and as a genderqueer character, the reader then sees other characters referring to Z by she/her pronouns as a girl or by a different name. These characters are juxtaposed against the authorial third-person voice that is presented as objective and accurate, thus positioning these characters as incorrect. So Shreve's use of third-person narration creates a refreshing tone in which Z doesn't need to prove their genderqueerness to any party before the narration, the authoritative voice of the story, describes them with their name and pronouns. In other words, Z's first-person authority is unspokenly respected by the third-person authority of the text itself. Even if it's contested by other characters within the fiction, the narrator accepts Z's identity as a fact of the story world and presents it in such a way that the reader can't ignore it. Given the misunderstandings and structural lack of agency non-binary people face, especially young ones, goes without saying, there is an empowering element to a narrative context where queer gender is recognised and the chosen names and pronouns of a character are simply accepted and presented as truth. Close third person provides a space to play this out, making non-binary identity possible within the very construction of the narrative. However, limited third person is still limited and can encounter the same quandaries of restricted perception found in first person. This is necessarily a bad thing, but it leads to different narrative effects. Maggie Tokuda Hall's The Mermaid, the Witch and the Sea from 2020 is told in close third person with alternating perspectives, something the author ultimately uses to explore the gender fluidity of her protagonist and the way gender might be projected and presumed in different contexts. The non-binary protagonist alternates being referred to as Flora, she, her, and Florian, he, him, depending on circumstance and upon which character the close third-person perspective is currently anchored in. Chapters directly reporting Flora's thoughts and actions use she to describe this character, but a different character observing the Florian persona, which is a masculine disguise, and reading this character as male will use he automatically. These assumptions about Flora/Florian's gender creates a cast full of unreliable narrators, save for Flora/Florian herself, who we can assume, again going by first-person authority, has the correct version. This shifting point of view and the shifting pronouns that go with it does mirror the realistic nature of perspective, and uses situations which the protagonist is kind of effectively misgendered to capture the complicated and flawed nature of perception and the ways in which people make assumptions about the genders of others. So Out of Salem and The Mermaid, the Witch, and the Sea both use the narration technique to separate the internal truth of the non-binary characters from the way they are perceived by others, placing its protagonists in unfriendly worlds in both cases, but nonetheless providing acceptance and affirmation at a textual level. These narration techniques create a space for non-binary possibility and sites in which non-binary identity is marked as a simple fact and narrative truth. But this potentiality can go deeper still if we detach almost entirely from popular convention and consider the least common form of YA narrative voice, omniscient third person, or the so-called epic voice or voice of God. So as Bond explores in her thesis Eye for a God's Eye, the bold choice of omniscient point of view in fiction for young adults, omniscient third person is the least common choice of narrative voice in YA, save for, quote, a stray oddity. Omniscient third person narrative voice is associated with, as the name implies, omniscient. As Monica Fludernick defines, a story is told as if from above, where the narrator is located godlike above and beyond the world of the story and sees and knows everything. Bond acknowledges that, quote, the very grandness of omniscience godlike associations may have put off some writers, especially writers of the ever-immediate teenage fiction, from using it. A narrative voice that floats above the characters and recounts their observations to the reader is yet another degree of psychic distance from the reader and might seem antithetical to YA. However, while it may not lend itself to every text, Bond argues for the potential of omniscient perspective in YA, citing works such as Marcus Zuzak's The Book Thief and Philip Pullman's His Dark Materials series as examples that execute it well. In particular, Bond suggests that the omniscient narrative voice lends itself well to the metatextual story about story, a playful intertextual framework that adolescent readers are primed to engage with. Following from Bond's suggestions, I argue that omniscient narration also has unique applications for playful queer storytelling, and may have an especially crucial role in stories of non-binary possibility. So, as of yet, I've not been able to find any existing examples of YA novels that with non-binary protagonists that use omniscient perspective, but that's alright because I have made my own. For the creative portion of my creative thesis, I have written a YA fantasy manuscript named Children of the Dusk, which is told in the style of a mythic saga or a collection of legends. The narration is in the bardic mode through which many myths were originally spread, with an all-seeing, all-encompassing perspective that allows the narrator to know the whole past, present, and future of the story, and to recount it as a sort of historian to the listener. It is not narrative convention to have an unreliable narrator at the omniscient level. The audience is not positioned to question the report of omniscient third-person narration in the same way they may accept the limitations or bias of first-person or some aspects of close third-person. So if omniscient narration is the voice of an all-seeing and incontestable authority recounting the immovable truth of the world and its events, then there's no arguing with this voice. So when the voice of God narrates that a character is non-binary, or recites their actions using neutral pronouns, that is the immovable, accurate, omnipotent truth of the universe. A queer affirmation at a cosmic level. So these, I argue, are the potential risks and benefits of three different narration styles. First person interlinks with first person authority and allows writers to play around with pronoun use, but is naturally limited as all first person narration is. Close third person allows for characters' pronouns and chosen names to be cemented as the rules of the text, but again maintains some of the limitations of first person. Omniscient third person lets a godlike narrator affirm non-binary identity as the truth of the narrative, though it does also take you several more steps away from the close psychic distance and emotional intimacy usually associated with YA. There is no one that stands out as the best one. Each works differently for different texts, and each has different narrative effects that have different advantages depending on the type of story writers are trying to tell. They all serve different purposes and have different applications, and it's something I will continue to explore in my creative and scholarly research. For now, I'm out of time, but thank you for coming with me on this adventure, and I look forward to your questions.